My name is Paul Henry, Security and Forensic Analyst at Dimension. Welcome to our Patch Tuesday update for February 2010. Now, after last month's Patch Tuesday from Microsoft, today's unusually large update, in fact the largest in about 4 years, it's going to provide for a difficult game of flaw remediation whack-a-mole at best. We have 13 bulletins, 5 rated critical, 7 important, and 1 moderate, addressing 26 different vulnerabilities. 11 impact the Windows operating system platform, and 2 impact Microsoft Office. Now, the IT workload will be unusually high this Patch Tuesday, as most of the bulletins impact Windows operating system platforms literally across the board. 9 impact Windows 2000, 8 impact Windows XP, 9 impact Windows Server 2003, 6 impact Vista, 8 impact Server 2008, 5 impact Windows 7, and 5 impact Windows Server 2008 R2. Now, with the complexity of this Patch Tuesday release, it is important to read and analyze each bulletin contained within the official Microsoft release fully in order to assign the necessary priorities for your individual enterprise. Now, let's look at an overview of this month's release from Microsoft. MS-10-006. It takes care of vulnerabilities in the SMB client that could allow remote code execution. It is rated as critical. It can provide for remote code execution. It does require a restart, and it impacts Microsoft Windows. MS-10-007. A vulnerability in the Windows shell handler could allow remote code execution. It is rated as critical. It can provide remote code execution. It does require a restart, and it impacts Microsoft Windows. MS-10-008. Now, this is a cumulative security update for ActiveX kill bits. It is rated as critical. It can provide remote code execution, and it may require a restart. It also impacts Microsoft Windows. Now, MS-10-009. This handles vulnerabilities in the Windows TCP/IP stack that could allow remote code execution. It is rated as critical. It can provide remote code execution, and it requires a restart. It also impacts Microsoft Windows. MS-10-013. This is a vulnerability in Microsoft DirectShow that could allow remote code execution. It is rated as critical. It can provide for remote code execution. It requires a restart, and it impacts Microsoft Windows. MS-10-003. Now, this is a vulnerability in Microsoft Office, MSO, that could allow remote code execution. It is rated as important. It can provide remote code execution, and it may require a restart. It also impacts Microsoft Office. MS-10-004. This handles vulnerabilities in Microsoft Office PowerPoint that could allow remote code execution. It is only rated as important. It can, however, provide remote code execution. It may require a restart, and it impacts Microsoft Office. Now, MS-10-010. This is a vulnerability in Windows Server 2008 Hyper-V that could facilitate a denial of service attack. It is rated as important. It can provide a denial of service, and it requires a restart. It also impacts Microsoft Windows. MS-10-011. A vulnerability in Windows Client Server Runtime Subsystem that could allow elevation of privilege. It is rated as important as it can provide for an escalation of privilege. It also requires a restart, and it does impact Microsoft Windows. MS-10-012. Now, this handles vulnerabilities in SMB server that could allow remote code execution. It is rated as important. It can provide remote code execution, and it requires a restart. It also impacts Microsoft Windows. MS-10-014. This handles a vulnerability in Kerberos that could provide for a denial of service. It is rated as important. It can provide a denial of service. It requires a restart, and it impacts Microsoft Windows. MS-10-015. This takes care of vulnerabilities in the Windows kernel that could allow an elevation of privilege. It is rated as important. It can provide an elevation of privilege. It requires a restart, and it impacts Microsoft Windows. MS-10-005 takes care of a vulnerability in Microsoft Paint. It could provide remote code execution. It is rated as moderate. However, it can provide for remote code execution. It does require a restart, and it impacts Microsoft Windows. Now, looking at priorities, MS-10-013, MS-10-006, and MS-10-007 stand out from the pack as urgent, and Microsoft also suggests a high priority on MS-10008 and MS-10015. Now, as a constant reminder that flaw remediation is not simply a Microsoft exclusive issue, we have the following other flaw remediation issues to address this Patch Tuesday period. On February 4th, Oracle released patches outside of their normal quarterly patch cycle for the WebLogic server to handle an issue where a vulnerability can be exploited without need of a username and authentication. The issue carries the highest severity Oracle CVSS rating of 10 for Windows on WebLogic server versions 9.0 and later. On February 3rd, Novell released a patch for NetStorage for an issue where a remote user may execute arbitrary code. The vulnerability does not require authentication and impacts both systems running on Novell and Linux. On February 3rd, LANDesk released a patch for a vulnerability in one of the LANDesk management gateway pages that allows an attacker to perform command injection under certain circumstances. This vulnerability could lead to arbitrary commands being executed under the root context. Version 4.0-1.48 and 4.2-1.8 of the LANDesk management gateway appliance are affected by this flaw. Now, Mozilla recently released the latest version of Firefox, version 3.6. This new version includes the capability to scan plugins like Adobe Flash Player and others for updates. Certainly, this is an upgrade that many will immediately opt to install to reduce their threat envelope caused by wayward, unpatched Firefox browser plugins. Now, Google Chrome also recently released a security update to handle 11 different vulnerabilities. Looking at Apple with OS X, administrators are still addressing the patches released from Apple on January 20th that took care of a dozen issues in OS X. Looking at Apple outside of their operating system, we also have 5 recent Apple iPhone security patches to deal with this Patch Tuesday period. Now, lastly, if your workload was not high enough already, details for a new Samba remote zero-day exploit were released by the researcher that discovered the flaw on February 5th. This has been our Patch Tuesday update for February 2010. Remember, patch wide and patch fast. Thank you for listening.